I'm very excited to get back to the topic of Genesis. And for those that have been following the talks by Dr. Willie McLeod and Pastor Carel Smith that joined us last week, I think it was a really, really interesting discussion, and I'm looking forward to the direction this conversation is heading in. And today, I'm very excited to announce that we'll be talking about the trees in the Garden of Eden and the snake. And I think there's quite a number of really surprising things that will come forward. So, welcome, Carel. Welcome, Willie. I look forward to the discussion. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I can start with a question that people have been asking me. So if you look at Genesis, was the snake really a snake, serpentine, or is there something else to it? Willie, I'm interested to hear what you say.
Yeah. So from my perspective, I think to understand this particular passage, again, we have to consider the ancient world from which this image originated. The serpent that's closely associated with a particular tree. In this case, we read that the tree was in the middle of the garden. It was a very special tree. It's called the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And the snake or the serpent that is associated with this tree, I think to understand this, we must consider the ancient world from which the Bible originated. Now, I must just reaffirm what is not always appreciated is that the Bible did not originate in a world very similar to our world. The biblical world were very, very, very different. Was very different from our world. The way of thinking about things, everything was just different. So in this ancient world, there was actually this theme of the snake associated with a tree, a beautiful tree, and it was especially closely linked with shamanism. Now the tree that has the eagle in the top of the tree and the snake in the bottom of the tree is also an image that we find already in ancient Sumer. There are various literary works that includes this motif. But we can also call it the cosmic tree. I think in the previous discussion we did talk about it a little bit. But the cosmic tree is just a reference to the image of the Earth's rotation. The Earth's rotation creates, when you look at the starry heavens, it creates the image of a pillar or something around which the whole cosmos rotates. And the ancients imagined this as a tree or a pillar. And it's called the axis mundi nowadays quite often, but it's just the world tree. We find it also in Ezekiel's description and here in Genesis. And that's why it's in the middle of the tree. It's a very special tree. And the role of the snake or the serpent and the association of the serpent with the tree, in my view, as this is the image that's been taken from ancient shamanism. So if we understand this background, then we can talk about the serpent.
Yes.
But first of all, we must understand that this is the background. So, for example, the fact that the serpent was able to speak, how should we understand that? And this is, I believe, something that we will discuss slightly later on in this discussion. But
yeah, because I think that it's this question around is it symbolism, or is there something real or tangible to it? But to your point, if you look at George Smith, a Assyriologist, he talks about the seal of Adam and Eve. And even in that, you've got these images of Adam and Eve facing a tree, or supposedly it's Adam and Eve and the snake in the background. But yeah, so it goes back.
So if we read in the passage here in Genesis, some interesting things that's been said here. The serpent said to the woman, that's verse 4 in chapter 3, you will surely not die. That's if you eat of the fruit that he's presenting to Eve. For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. So this is clearly a very special kind of fruit we're talking about, because your eyes will be opened. Version, but in my French Bible, it says will be like gods. So you will be like gods. Your eyes will be opened, and you will be like gods, knowing good and evil. So clearly, this is something that's not in the usual sense. You know, if you eat the apple, it was often said that the apple, you know, it was an apple or whatsoever. Now, the apple idea of the apple comes from the Celtic tradition, where it's a long story why it's like that. But the point of the matter is it can't be an apple. It must be something else. The kind of fruit involved here, the eyes will be opened, they will become like gods. And the speaking serpent should be understood in this context.
Yes. I think, and you can correct me on this, but I think the word, where the theme of the apple comes from is the Latin word was for apple is malum, and malum also serves as evil. So I think there was this little connotation between the two, and I think that's probably where it originates.
Yeah, in the Celtic tradition, there's a very old tradition about a paradisal kind of island, and on this island is a tree with golden apples. It's also in the Greek tradition.
Oh yes,
and I think that's where it originated. Yeah.
Perfect. Carel, anything to add to that?
Thank you, Lube. Yeah, I would just support Willie in this whole big question about this chapter in the Bible. There have been many discussions on how should we understand the talking snake. Should it be literally understood? Did it really happen? Many people, Christians, believe that we should take it just like that. The snake physically talked to Eve. Or should it be merely a story with just symbolism? It didn't really happen that way. How should we as Christians understand it? And I think what Willie is saying is really helps us a lot. You know, if the better we can understand the setting, the milieu in which this story originated, the more it will help us. I've read some of Willie's articles and understand how the Sumerian people saw these things and how they used these motives. I think Willie will say more about that. But maybe, Willie, you can also just explain a little bit about the shamanistic culture. I don't know how well known it is what shamanism is. And, you know, in that time, it seems to have been a normal way of life. It was quite general. Yeah, so if through this discussion we can understand better or we can interpret this text better, it will really help us. Thanks, Willie.
I think the closest parallel in the Bible is probably the passage about Balaam. Now, Balaam, we read about him that story. It's in Numbers 22, verse 27 to 30. We also find the donkey speaking in that case. So, whereas in this case, it's a serpent speaking, in that case, it's a donkey speaking. And now, Balaam is described as a kind of sorcerer, or in the context of the time, I think the best way to describe him is most possibly as a shaman, a kind of shamanistic person. And not only does the donkey speak to him, we hear about the very same things. We also hear, he says that he is the man with the opened eyes. So his eyes is opened, and this is exactly what the serpent says to Eve: your eyes will be opened. And in the context of shamanism, we do find that the shamans in their kind of experience believe that they eventually become gods. And this is exactly what we read here. You will be like gods. So I think the closest parallel is definitely in biblical framework is the story of Balaam, and in Numbers where we read about the donkey speaking. Now, when we consider the shaman, obviously we are on a totally different level of existence. The shamanistic experience, if we can describe it in this way, is more a spiritual kind of thing. It's not a physical, that the donkey spoke physically. This is definitely not, I believe, what is we should understand this passage. And the same goes for the snake or the serpent. So the speaking here should be understood in the context. This is the shamanistic context. And in the shamanistic context, speaking with spirits, or let me rather say communicating with spirits, is very basic to that kind of world. So in this story in Genesis 3, what is basic here is the speaking serpent, in my view, should be understood in a spiritual context. So this is actually a spirit that's been spoken of. This is a serpent, the kind of spirit. Now, this also goes back to ancient Sumer. What is interesting in ancient Sumer, I've already mentioned on the top of this cosmic tree, one often finds a large eagle, and in the bottom of the tree, one finds a serpent. Now, this serpent is often depicted as a woman with a serpent's lower body. And she presents herself to the initiate, the young initiate. And in this case, her breasts actually refer to the mushrooms under this particular tree, which, for example, the beech tree that is found in these northern regions. So that he should take this mushrooms, eat it, and have this kind of experience. So it's a very similar kind of image that we find in the biblical description. So I believe, since we have this very same motive from very ancient tradition, from these northern regions where in the previous discussion, we saw that this is where Eden was, the Garden of Eden should be located according to the description in Genesis 2, then I believe this is also how we should understand it. So now for the eagle and for the serpent, what is also interesting in ancient Sumer is the eagle was able, there's a story about Itana, in which all the serpent's feathers were plucked out by the serpent, by the way. He was locked up beneath the tree in a kind of jail, let's call it. It was Hades, I think it's represented there. But then he grows again. These feathers is grown again. And this is something that actually happens to eagles. They can lose all their feathers and grow new feathers. And the same happens with serpents. And we find this, for example, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where a serpent, he has this particular strange plant with him, and the serpent stole it. And when he stole away, he actually loses his, he got a totally new skin. He lost his old skin and he get renewed his skin. So now this idea of renewal suggests that both the serpent and the eagle were seen on a different level. They had a kind of existence going far beyond that. They're not just animals. They present something more. Spiritual beings. And this is what I also think we find in the Bible, or for example, the cherubim of the Bible, the cherub is described, for example, early in Psalms, I think it's Psalm 18, as an eagle. And the seraphs are described as burning serpents. So we have these same or similar kind of creatures much later in biblical tradition. And then also in the story about Moses lifting up the serpent on the pole, this particular word used for the serpent is actually a seraph. So it refers to a seraph, a kind of spiritual being presented as a burning or flying snake. And in this case, the serpent and the pole going together, I think it has reference to Genesis chapter 3 of the serpent being associated with this tree. So that's why I believe that this is actually a spiritual being. This is how we should understand it. And it's a spiritual being that approaches Eve with the fruit. And the fruit that's being spoken of here is not the apple or something. It's these mushrooms, allogenetic kind of mushrooms. And if she ate that, something would have happened. Her eyes would have opened. She's got access to a spiritual world. And within the context of this spiritual world, one of the kind of experiences available is that to become like gods. And I think it's in this context that we should understand it.
Yeah, and it sort of aligns with what Michael Heiser says. I mean, he refers to the term nakash, and he says that's a divine being. So it's quite in line with what you're saying now. Carel, any comments on that?
Yeah, this is very amazing. I think it really helps me to understand the text better, the biblical text. Willie mentioning that these symbols or motives represent spiritual realities in the spiritual realm. And somehow it seems that the shamanistic people were also in touch with this spiritual realm. And there seems to be a connection between those old motives in that spirit world, which was identified with these symbols, and in the Bible, the same motives identified. The snake obviously being connected to the Satan as the fallen angel or the fallen seraphim or cherubim, whichever way you want to see it. So that helps me to understand this text much better. Still, the question exists, what precisely happened? It seems it was not the physical, this didn't play out precisely as described in the physical world or in the physical realm. But in the spiritual realm, it describes something that happened that impacted Adam and Eve.
And I just wanted, I sort of wanted to add what you're saying there, Carel. So if you look at it objectively, there's certain things that apparently wasn't meant for, or certain access wasn't meant for Adam and Eve. And this divine being came and gave them access to this. And if you refer to become like gods, that sort of refers to the divine council, I believe. But so there was an intentionality to break that relationship between Adam and Eve and God, because he walked with them in the garden. Do you guys have any thoughts around that?
So I think the enmity between God and the serpent clearly predicts the serpent as an opponent of God. In coming to tempt Eve to disobey God, clearly, the serpent is taking a role opposing God. So this means that when we talk about the fall of the next, in 2 weeks' time, we will have to reconsider this. But clearly, the serpent is already a fallen creature.
Yes.
So when we come to the story in the garden and what happened here, it's not so simple as to say, okay, when Adam and Eve disobeyed God, the fall happened, because the serpent is already fallen. And the conflict between God and the serpent is also something that we find in ancient Sumerian context, where we have the conflict between the eagle and the snake or the serpent. The eagle typically being a being that is associated with the Most High God. And the serpent typically, especially in the ancient world and in ancient Sumer, were associated with the netherworld, the world of the dead.
Yes.
closely intimately associated with the netherworld. And in the Epic of Eternal, we find a story where this conflict is clearly very nicely presented, between the conflict between the eagle and the serpent. And I believe that's similar to what we find in Genesis. The conflict between God, who is associated with a cherubim that's with him, that guards the garden, etc., which is also present here and which is presented as eagles, as I've already mentioned in the Bible, in opposite to versus the serpent. So it's the same kind of conflict. And I believe that the fallen serpent, as a fallen creature, is closely related to the fact that this is a spiritual being. The fall and everything, we'll talk about it next time. But this is a spiritual event primarily.
Yes.
So we should read the serpent, in my view, here as a spiritual being, as a fallen being, as a being that is closely related to what is later called seraphs in the Bible. But the seraph could be, there are two kinds. It seems to me that there were fallen seraphs and there were other seraphs that served God. So this is would be one of the fallen ones. So he, when he approaches Eve and so forth, although later in the Bible we read it's the devil that comes in the form of the serpent, clearly the devil is closely and uniquely linked with the serpent. But I think in this case, it's just probably a messenger of Satan, if you want to see it in those terms. But in my view, this is a very primitive description going back very early in biblical tradition. So since it's so early, many of the concepts that later developed was not yet present at this early stage. So if we see it in that way, the basic fact of the matter is this is already the conflict between God and the serpent. And what we find here, that's why I come back to say this is a spiritual being, and the serpent talking can be nothing else, could not be understood in any other way than a kind of shamanistic experience that Eve had here. In the same way that Balaam had a kind of spiritual experience in understanding or hearing the donkey speaking and so forth. And the similar terminology, the eyes that's open, becoming like gods, all those things. And Balaam also speaks about hidden knowledge and all those kind of terminologies that he uses. So it's the occult tradition. That's what I think.
Yeah. So my next question is, if you look at what happened in the Garden of Eden and sort of that conflict or between Adam and Eve and the snake, how would a 2nd century Jew have looked at that situation? Would they have sort of incorporated some of these Sumerian or shamanistic traditions?
In my view, not. I don't think so. You see, the problem is that the Bible has a long history. There are different views about it, but in my view, this part of the Bible, the primeval history, is very old. I believe it was handed down from the fathers, via the Abrahamic family. When Moses wrote it, he already received the source material for this part 1 to 11, chapters 1 to 11. So this is very old material in my view.
Yeah.
So the Bible had a long period through which it came into existence. Now, people, for example, living in the time of Jesus wouldn't have had that perspective. They would have had a perspective that it's old and it goes back very long in history and so on. But remember, a lot of things has happened in the meantime, and there had been a development in their concepts about things. So in their terms, I think, this is what we read in Revelation, is they clearly just understood this as the devil tempting Eve. And I think there's nothing wrong to understand it also in that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
What would you say, Carel?
Willie, I'm trying to bring it a little bit more to the ground. Maybe this is just a general description of the direction the early people took. But if you read in Genesis, I think 6, talking about the fallen angels, I think it's the book of Enoch, I'm not sure, where these angels taught the people,
it's Enoch 1, yes. Yeah.
Occultic practices.
Yeah.
And it seems that Eve, yes, somehow, and Adam in the end, begin to take part in some occultic practices which opened their eyes and which lured them into the spirit world. And if you read the Bible, the Lord was very strict for his people not to take part in any occult practices. So maybe it's something in that direction that happened. I'm just trying to make it out.
I agree with that. Yeah, because I actually agree with that, because they were taught not to do certain things, and we were not meant to have that access, and that was basically leveraged, I think, with my limited knowledge. So,
but this explains why it's prohibited. So I think one should explain why. At first, one should understand why is it, or how is it possible for the serpent to speak? How was it able to talk?
Yes.
On the other hand, what about the fruit? What kind of fruit would this be? That allows you to attain this opened eyes, secret knowledge about good and evil, becoming like gods. Obviously, this is not just any kind of fruit that grows with this tree. Yes. So this is why I say it's this hallucinogenic kind of mushrooms growing with the beers and other trees, but especially the beers, which is a beautiful tree, a long white tree. It's just beautiful. And it's in this context that we should understand it. And God, I believe that this is introduced very much because God is saying certain things is not allowed.
Yes.
And throughout the Pentateuch, right through, we get the same message. This is not allowed. You're not allowed to become involved in the occult. And this begins in Genesis 3. Where God says this is not allowed. So everything that we find in chapter 3 is basic to the occult experience, the shamanistic experience. And what God is saying is, no, this is not allowed. And this is what we find throughout the Pentateuch. So it's important because so many of the laws given in the Pentateuch builds upon this, what happened in Genesis chapter 3. So that's why I believe Moses wrote this, but with this, he introduces a very important thing. What is the kind of worship that is acceptable to God, to the Hebrew God in that framework? So what he's saying is what is acceptable, and when we talk about the fall, I believe we'll return to what happened after that and so on, and the kind of sacrifices that God required stands in opposite to this kind of experience that was available. And I think what we should also understand, if we look at Balaam, for example, the longer we go back in history, if we go back and study history, we find that things change. Like, for example, when we read the Bible, we have a certain perspective on God. But this perspective on God revealing himself as Yahweh, for example, to Moses at the burning bush. Before Moses, God was not known in that way. He says it explicitly. He was not known in that way. So before Moses, things were different. It was much more primitive. Their ways of thinking was much more primitive. And for example, with Balaam, strangely enough, God even spoke through Balaam, which just doesn't make sense. I mean, how could God use this occult person to speak through him? But the point of the matter is there was a primitive age, an early primitive age, before people had the full understanding and the clear understanding of God's revelation. God revealed himself from early on already through nature and so forth. But there's a progressiveness in God's revelation. more and more. With Moses, it was a dramatic and important step in this process. And this step was to say that this kind of experience that was previously, because of, let's say, the fact that people didn't know what was truly right and wrong, etc., etc. But this has to change. And Moses goes back in this writing and says that you're already in the garden, you can't say no. And this is important for your worship, to understand that and to say no to the occult experience.
And it's that being obedient to God.
Exactly. Yeah.
I just want to add something. Thanks, Lebay, about in verse 4, the serpent said to the woman, "You will not die." God knows that when you eat of the fruit, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. That Hebrew word is Elohim. And Willie said correctly that in the King James and New King James, it's been translated as gods. You'll be like gods. I was just wondering, does this refer to God, the Almighty, the Most High? Or does it refer to the sons of God, who were these angels, who had certain abilities, occultic abilities, which they wanted to transfer illegally or open up illegally to man in this way? What do you think?
In my view, early on, the word angel is a relative light word, the messenger. This is not the word that we find in the ancient world. It's a later development in Hebrew tradition. So originally, what's later called an angel was called the sons of God, or was called gods.
Yep.
So one will also find sporadically throughout the Old Testament, there's often reference is made to the gods. For example, in Psalm 82. So the gods are referred to elsewhere in Scripture, but this is actually the very ancient usage. When all the spiritual beings, most of them, there was some kind of other spirits and so on that was in a later hierarchy, but all the higher hierarchy of spiritual beings were called gods. But that changed. So in Hebrew tradition, it was God and the angels. And then the other gods were the heathen gods. So from a biblical perspective, in that later development of the understanding of things, originally it was just the highest God and the other gods, but later on, especially from Mosaic times, it was God in opposition to the pagan gods, and under God was the angels. So one would, for example, find, let me give you an example. In Genesis chapter 6, reference is made to the sons of God. Carel, you've made reference to that, and I believe we will have a very interesting discussion on this in a few weeks' time. But in the Pentateuch, the Greek translation made in the 3rd century BC, before Christ, it's 230 years before the time of Jesus, this was translated as angels. So you'll find in the Pentateuch angels, the angels, not the sons of God, but the angels. So this shows us how this early usage in reference, for example, in Genesis chapter 3 to gods. And clearly some translators were a little bit scary to translate gods in here, because there's such a, from the lighter perspective and understanding of things, saying that you'll be like gods sounds like being like God seems to be the best way, because there's only one God and that's God. But that's a later way of understanding things. Obviously, there are just one God, but early on, all the other gods under God, let's call it that, were called gods, under the highest God. It was just the terminology of the time. But later on, they were called angels. So in the Hebrew Bible, especially in later tradition, some places I've mentioned Psalm 82, and there's many other references, gods does appear. But what we find more and more is reference to angels.
Yeah, but my question is still that was Eve tempted to be like the Most High God, or just like these other gods who had occultic abilities?
Yeah, no, I don't think it was the Most High God. Definitely not. She would never be like God. So it was about becoming. What you find in shamanism is these shamans believe that they reach a certain state, a divine state, where they are gods. They are divine beings. And this is, I think, what is referenced here. So it's like angels or something, but they're divine. Yeah.
If you read Mike Heiser and these guys as well, he sort of suggests that it refers to the Benai, Elohim.
That's quite possible. Yeah, but I think just counsel. Without taking too, I'm a little bit afraid of just taking jumps and incorporating other aspects that's not clearly in the passage.
Yeah.
So that's why it's important, in my way of thinking, to understand the basic background, how this kind of ideas has developed and how it's found in pre-biblical tradition, how it's been incorporated in biblical tradition, because there's a long continuous tradition. God was active in the world long before Moses. There can't be any doubt about that. So we must understand that. And in this case, the reference to gods is definitely just, they will become like divine beings. And that's what's typical about the shamanistic experience. They have this kind of experience. And this is also related to the Tree of Life, I think.
And I just wanted to ask if we can move on to the Tree of Life. It features in a couple of places in the Bible as well, not just in
so that Genesis. Is also in the middle. Both are in the middle of the garden, the Tree of Life and the Tree of the Knowledge of Good and Evil. So what's the difference between the two? The first one has a certain kind of fruit that would open their eyes. So I think these things are related. It's probably just different names. And the one refers to a certain kind of aspect related to this tree. And this is that the eyes would open, they would understand the difference between God and the gods, and this whole occult, what is wrong, what is dark, what is not accepted. And on the other hand, I believe so, that, okay.
So the Tree of Life is also mentioned in Revelation. It has to be something different.
Yeah.
And there's specific occult knowledge.
Exactly, yeah. So it's God prohibits it, and I think we should see it in that context.
Also in a spiritual context. So my question is: so Adam and Eve, obviously, can I call it immortality? They were.
Yeah. So I think this is actually becoming like gods should be seen as immortal.
Yes.
And in that sense, it's also the Tree of Life, eternal life.
Yeah.
And so God, once they have understood that this was wrong, they wanted to eat it, they ate it, and then God said, well, they're going to take it too far. And God restricted them from the garden. And this not allowing them to continue with this practice and becoming like gods then. So it shows that God is not only against it, but this is not in God's plan for man.
Yes. I don't know if you guys can answer this, but if you look at Revelation, it also talks about the Tree of Life, but it says the Tree of Life is on opposite sides of the river and it will heal the nations. Any sort of thoughts around that? Or is that a topic for a different time?
Yeah, I think that context is very different. It's not the same context. And also there are not just one tree, there are many trees. And also read that the trees, the fruit of the trees are for healing, the branches and so forth. So it's a very different kind of depiction that we have in Revelation. I think we should be careful to relate these to the same thing.
Okay.
This is just my way of thinking.
Yeah.
What do you think, Carel?
I will rest my case with that.
I think we're always at risk of, tying things into each other should possibly not go together, and it turns into this whole philosophical mishmash of things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
But
exactly.
there is a relation, because it is, you know, living forever, being healed, being recovered, and you know, it's obviously talks about eternal life, or living forever in both Genesis and Revelation. So that seems to be the general idea.
Yeah. So we have about 5 minutes left. I want to ask Carel, from a pastoral point of view, what's the lesson to be taken from the Garden of Eden?
I would really say that people can be encouraged that the Bible is not just a fairy tale or some stories which somebody thought of in Babylonian exile, but it's really based on very deep truths, very deep motives, which came a long way. And even this story in Genesis about the talking serpent and Eve and so on, we can still believe it, and but we just have to understand the right context. So we do not have to doubt the word of God in these times. If we understand the context correctly, we can still cling to this early stories as God's revelation of his will and his plan for us. We do not have to doubt it.
Yeah. Anything, or any final thoughts from your side, Willie?
No, I absolutely agree. You know, once we understand that the Bible should be read within the ancient world from which it originated, and we take the background into account, we must gain a much better understanding of the things that we read in the Bible, and things that we wouldn't have thought about in our current context. But once we understand it in an ancient context, it's self-explanatory. So suddenly it makes sense. It's quite clear what the meaning is. And the kind of doubt that is often heaped upon these verses from people that do not take the ancient world and the background context into consideration, it totally disappears.
Yeah, it's really wonderful. I mean, when you talk about the fact that it goes back to ancient times and prehistory and that kind of thing, the fact that there is, right from the beginning, there's that golden thread that runs right through from prehistory. It's the Garden of Eden, and right until Revelation and into our days. So nothing stands separate. Everything is part of that greater whole, which is it's absolutely incredible. Like I think if people just read the Bible as a book with interesting stories, they miss out on so much, especially if you don't look at it from that ancient worldview. So yeah. Anything else? I'm really looking forward to in 2 weeks' time the discussion, and yes, and I just wanted to sort of just say that this again is a joint effort between Core Ideas and the Bible GPS. When we post it on YouTube or any of the other platforms, we will give links to Willie's articles, to Core Ideas, as well as the Bible GPS. And again, if anybody has any questions or thoughts or want us to discuss something, to please reach out. The contact details are on those websites. But again, thank you, Carel. Thank you, Willie. This was absolutely fantastic. I really enjoyed it.
God bless. Thank you, Ron.